This isn't a book club, Grace said. We're just getting together to talk about a paperback book we all happen to read. We're a book club, we're not a book club. Who cares? Kitty said. What I want to know is why Betty Gore came at her good friend Candy Montgomery with an axe and how the heck she got chopped up instead.
I think my knowledge of serial killers and the specifics of certain true crime cases takes up like half of the storage in my brain, which is not a fact I'm proud of per se. There was a point where I consumed true crime content so regularly, I started recognizing the cases the YouTubers I watch were about to discuss based on the clickbaity titles they would give to their videos alone. And don't get me wrong, I still occasionally consume true crime, probably more often than the average person, but at some point it was just putting me in such a state of paranoia and negativity that I gradually just stepped away on my own. It wasn't like a conscious decision or anything. Maybe we just sometimes like develop an aversion to the things that once made us happy by virtue of changing personalities, changing circumstances, and that's okay. Anyway, all that is to say, I truly loved true crime, probably still do, but I really loved true crime for such a significant portion of my life. I was consuming podcasts, most of my subscription feed was true crime videos, it actually still is, to the point that it started spilling over into like the ASMR content I watch, and I'd watch like ASMR true crime, which is truly one of the most niche topics I've ever attached myself to. One of the only non-required reading books I read in its entirety while I was in college, which was a time where I did not have time to like read anything. I wasn't even doing my required reading, let alone like outside reading. But one of the only books I actually finished voluntarily on my own was Helter Skelter. And I was so consumed by that book that I ended up doing like an entire research paper on the Manson family for class, for like an abnormal psychology class. When I discuss the ethics of true crime in this video, this is not a condemnation of the people who consume it, because I am the people who consume it. And I still find it one of the easiest genres to get into for me, one of the easiest genres to consume for me. I get gripped by it very quickly. Like even when I step back from it, like I said, I'm still consuming it more than the average person. And that's why I could never judge it, and I'd never want to, because I think so much of our fascination with true crime is just pure human nature, and it probably overlaps a lot with the discussion of like our enjoyment of horror that I referenced in my Yellow Jackets video. But what I do feel some level of comfort in discussing and almost like judging just a tiny bit is the fictionalization of it for TV and like movies, I guess, but I'm not discussing movies here, because of all the mediums that I mentioned previously. Did I mention any mediums previously? Of all the mediums it can be consumed in, there can be a lot of ethical qualms and dubious practices, sure, especially in terms of like monetization of the retelling of the stories that generally are, as a rule, the most harrowing incidents in the lives of most of the people mentioned in them. And they're usually their final moments. But at the end of the day, the people who are telling those stories tend to try their best to transmit the facts. They do not alter the stories to fit a dramatic arc or a necessary characterization that they need. As a general rule, no matter how you feel about how these retellings are executed, it is often a rehashing of already established facts.
I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. Everything in this video is publicly available information that myself and my research team have found online and just compiled into this video.
And even when opinion is infused into the facts, it is often easy to parse out and identify as separate from the objectivity of the rest of it. And that's not always the case, obviously, and since so much of true crime is unregulated, personally created content, there's obviously plenty of room for mistakes and for errors. Those are synonyms. But as a rule, it seems, I said as a rule so many times. I typed as a rule so many times. Anyway. But as a rule, it seems that the goal at the end of the day is to just give us the facts. Whether that is through like a YouTube video, a podcast, or probably the most regulated vehicle on this list, and usually the one that involves the most work and carries the most credibility, would be like a nonfiction book. And separate from this list, for me at least, is true crime fiction, which refers to TV shows and movies based on true crime cases. Because first of all, the scale is on a whole different level. A TV show is not a podcast or a YouTube video. No matter how much the latter two have grown in impact and reach, a TV show is still a TV show, especially ones starring famous figures and created by known individuals. They carry so much more weight and they impact so many more minds. They also usually stand to gain a lot more out of larger productions of that nature. So when it happens to be that those productions with the most reach are also the ones who take liberties with the truth and and the way it is framed the most often, it then becomes a question of where do we draw the ethical line in the sand? When is it too far? When is it no longer true crime? When is it actually damaging? And does any of that even make a difference? Because again, I cannot overstress this enough. I am never advocating for the eradication of true crime. If not for anything, then at the very least because of the knowledge that that's just a futile goal. Our very nature as human beings would prevent that from ever happening. Like the very first true crime book, John Reynolds, I'm gonna butcher this because it's spelled really weird, but it's The Triumph of God's Revenge Against the Crying and Execrable Sin of Murder, dates as far back as 1635, and consistently true crime media remains one of the most widely consumed and discussed genres in all its forms. But if true crime media will continue to be created, which it will, and since we have so many examples of it, then there could be a discussion of where we are willing to draw the lines regarding the ethics of how it is done, and how much of a creative license should people really be getting with the most tragic moments of someone else's life, and when the impact of something starts leading to more harm than good. So for the video today, like 500 years after my last video, I am discussing two shows that were made on the Betty Gore Candy Montgomery case, and I'm also discussing Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story, which is obviously about Jeffrey Dahmer, shocking. And I will admit upfront, going into these three, I had some preconceived notions about which of the shows were going to provoke the most moral outrage and which I expected no issues from. And I was completely wrong. Anyway, so I'm first going to start, like always, by summarizing the plot of the shows, although two of them are exactly the same case, so I'm going to be just summarizing the actual case. And at the end, we're going to talk about how I don't know anything and nothing really matters anyway, which is great. So again, since Candy and Love and Death are both covering the same incident, I'm just going to summarize the main highlights of what took place, and I will try to note any differences or liberties either of the shows took with the truth wherever I can, but we will delve further into that in the next section. Candy Montgomery and Betty Gore lived in Texas in the 70s. Both were married. Why did I say 70s like that? In the 70s. I keep saying it weird. Anyway, both were married. Candy Montgomery was married to Pat Montgomery, and Betty Gore was married to Alan Gore. They both belonged to the same community since they regularly attended the same church, and for all intents and purposes, they were considered friends. Candy seemed to be kind of just bored, to be honest. She was sick of her life, kind of sick of the lack of gratitude that comes with being a mother and a wife, which is valid. Her complaints sounded very valid to me. So she made the executive decision to have an affair with Alan Gore. And I say executive because that really is what it was. Like, they were very businesslike about setting up the arrangement. And I can't figure out if that makes it all better or worse. It makes it a bit funnier to consume at least. But in such a dark situation, to find some levity in the way they conducted themselves is maybe not a bad thing. Anyway, she very bluntly approaches Alan Gore to tell him that she feels attracted to him and wants to have an affair with him, with the expressed sentiment that she in no way wants to hurt his marriage, it's just an affair. So after a little bit, he gives in and they start having an affair that seems to be born out of, again, boredom. It's impossible to tell what the feelings on both their ends were, but Candy at the very least appears to have grown a bit attached. I think based on a letter I ended up reading in the book, I think Alan does seem to have grown a bit attached too. And when Betty Gore starts feeling like her husband does not want her, especially in the fragile emotional state she was often in during that time period, Alan tries to amicably end the affair, but Candy flat out refuses. And then Alan and Betty go on like a marriage therapy retreat kind of thing, and it kind of just does magic for their connection and their relationship, and it effectively ends the affair between Alan and Candy. On June 13, 1980, I like June 13 as a date, but I don't like it here, Alan Gore had to leave town for business. His wife was very affected negatively by him leaving in her postpartum state, having recently given birth and being worried that she might be pregnant again. Betty's other daughter is staying at the Montgomerys for a sleepover, so Candy goes over to the Gores to pick up her swimsuit. No one unequivocally knows what actually happened in that house that day. We only know what came out in testimony later on. But the visit ends with Betty Gore dead on the floor, 41 stabs of an axe eradicating all chances of her survival. Candy goes home, showers, hacks some of her clothes up into pieces, and then has to continue on with the duties of her day, continually reiterating that the reason she missed some things is because she went to Target and lost track of time. She misses a performance or something at the church. I worded that vaguely. Alan Gore, panicked over his wife not picking up the phone for the whole day, and knowing she was already unhappy about him leaving from the beginning and was in a pretty fragile emotional state, asks the neighbors to go check on her. They find her dead body, and her head is so severely attacked that they think it must have been a gunshot wound. They find her infant child in her crib, screaming, dirty, and uncared for 13 hours. Alan heads home immediately, obviously. The news spreads. An investigation is launched. Candy is interviewed, being the last person to have been at the scene. But no one really suspects her at the beginning because A, they have no real reason to at this point. No one knows about the affair. And B, the crime is so gruesome, so vicious, that they assume a larger man must have been behind it, not a slight housewife from the suburbs.
God knows Candy couldn't have done this. The congregation needs to understand that God knows this.
After Alan After Alan Gore is interviewed, however, he decides to call the police back and report that he omitted some information. And he shares that he and Candy Montgomery had an affair that had been over for 8 months at that point. So Candy then becomes a suspect. A lot happened regarding the escalation to the point of her getting arrested and her bail and who her lawyers are and what people know and stuff like that. But those are extra details about the case itself. So if you do want all the info, of the 3 works I consumed this exact incident through, I wrote down I would recommend Candy the most. I don't think I do. I barely even recommend any of them. I don't know, maybe look it up online. Anyway, so now Candy Montgomery is on trial for the murder of Betty Gore, and she is claiming self-defense. She claims Betty found out about the affair with Alan. No one really has any details as to how or why that came to be, but that's what Candy says happened. And agitated and in an emotional state, she confronted her about it that day when Candy came to pick her daughter's swimsuit up. Candy fesses up, says it happened, but it's been over for ages, and that she does not want him. And allegedly, that kind of just escalates from that conversation up to Betty Gore grabbing an axe and attacking Candy, leading Candy to have to defend herself with 41 stabs. Is that what, a swing of an axe is called? Is it a stab? I guess it's a stab. So, all the details of the trial aside, the narrative that gets sold is just that, the narrative Candy could report. The only things forensics could get across was that the attack with an axe happened, and they were both involved in it, and there was a struggle. I feel like forensics can really only confirm or deny so much, especially when everything that forensics could tell us was basically incorporated into the narrative Candy Montgomery reported later on anyway. Does that make sense? There was no one else there. No one could say who actually came at whom, or what Betty knew, or how things developed. No one but the person who stood accused of the murder. And that's the issue. Anyway, so at the end of the day, they considered it self-defense, and Candy Montgomery was deemed not guilty by a jury of her peers. And then 4 decades later, they made 2 TV shows about it, less than 1 year apart, and now here I am summarizing it. Dahmer is a bit harder to summarize, mostly because I don't think what happened really lends itself to causal narration. The events don't tie together in a way where one leads to the other, and then one leads to the other, and so forth. It's not like A happened, and then the tension ramped up, and then B happened. It's just Dahmer was born, and then a bunch of innocent people died. He had a weird childhood, had some weird hobbies, seemed generally hard to get along with, was kind of aloof, and maybe a little bit hard to understand, especially if you're in high school in the 70s. Both his parents, for their own individual reasons, seem to have not paid enough attention to him, especially at such an impressionable age. But one thing he bonded over with his father was taxidermy, which was either sparked by or fed into Dahmer's fascination with bones and flesh and stuff. I could not tell if that led to it or if Dahmer only showed interest in this particular activity because he already was interested in dead animals and everything that comes with that. So getting involved with taxidermy with his father was something he already had interest in, or the two fed into each other in a cyclical manner. Dahmer had a kind of rough childhood, but certainly no rougher than a lot of people. A lot of other people had it so much worse. And I don't think anyone really tries to deny that. But when his parents accidentally left him home alone for a prolonged period after the separation, showcasing how much they were focused on themselves and their own interests and their own issues with their relationship rather than focusing on their son, and how all this affected him, he ended up committing his first murder, killing Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker he had picked up and lured to his house with the promise of beer and a ride to the concert he was trying to get to. Then Dahmer joined the army, but because of a drinking problem that has been worsening since he was in high school, he was deemed unsuitable for service and he was discharged. He ended up eventually having to move in with his grandmother while he tried to keep a job and deal with his escalating drinking problems, for which he was arrested a couple of times. Eventually, Dahmer started exploring the area he lived in and frequenting clubs and bathhouses and stuff, and it seems he discovered that he got frustrated when his sexual partners would move during the act. He didn't want them to move, basically. He wanted them to be still as a corpse. So necrophilia. He discovered necrophilia. So he started drugging people before them while they were passed out. He got banned from the bathhouses when enough of a pattern was established. In 1987, 9 years after the first murder he committed, Dahmer committed his second murder. He claims he had no intention of killing Stephen Tuomi, but he took him to a hotel and he says he only intended to drug and assault him like he had been doing with the others. I guess, only, yeah. He also claims he has no recollection of committing the murder. He just woke up and Tuomi was dead next to him. But after that, he kind of just kept doing it, but like intentionally this time. And in 1988, he was arrested for drugging and fondling a 13-year-old boy. He pleaded guilty and was given basically a slap on the wrist. I'm trying to be as objective as possible in this section, but just imagine the lives that could have been saved had this specific charge been treated with the gravitas it deserved. Imagine how many people would not have died brutally at Dahmer's hands had a crime like that been automatically issued the punishment it warranted, instead of probation and 1 year in a house of correction, where he also got a work release. I will go over more of his specific victims, his specific crimes, and the way the show portrayed them in a little bit, because I don't want to overload you with too much, and it gets pretty heavy. So starting from the second murder, he just seems like he was pretty active pretty regularly. There was barely any rest period except when he was very briefly put away for something else. So he was active for around 5 years, and the total number of victims that we know of is 17. In 1991, Dahmer attempted to murder Tracy Edwards the way he had so many men before him, by luring him to his apartment with the false promise of modeling work and money. Knowing exactly where this was going to end up for him, as Dahmer had promised that he would eat his heart, Edwards managed to buy himself some time by placating him for a bit, when he realized that just attacking him head-on wasn't going to get him anywhere. By buying himself more time, he eventually saw an opportunity to escape, punched Dahmer, and ran out the front door. He eventually flagged down a couple of police officers and led them back to Dahmer's apartment, but not without some unfounded suspicion on their part towards the victim. But that was where they found like a whole bunch of stuff. That man was not discreet. They literally found a head in his fridge. And so he was arrested and he confessed all the things. But I feel like what other choice was there really? Like they found a head in his fridge. At some point, it gets kind of hard to explain shit away. So that was that. And now I need a break and I'm gonna go watch a Disney movie or something before we proceed with the next section of the video. Maybe you should take a breather too. Here is something cute to alleviate the emotional turmoil hearing all this can cause. I do apologize. It is kind of a given at this point that works of fiction depicting real-life events will almost always get an artistic license. The freedom to alter the truth within reason, to be able to deliver a more cohesive, a digestible, and in some cases more artistically developed story than reality is capable of handing us. And usually that's completely understandable by most audiences. Reality is messy, and we may say otherwise, but we hardly ever want to see it presented unaltered to us. Even reality shows and documentaries, things meant to be presenting reality as it is, take some liberties with the editing to make things flow better, make things more cohesive and put together, because that's generally what we want. Even when we seek out reality in the works we consume, we don't mean unedited reality. We can just turn the TV off for that. We mean reality edited for the benefit of our entertainment. Reality that is just a bit more elevated than actual reality. So when true crime cases get fictionalized, usually the artistic license thing is understandable to a degree. There has to be a line drawn somewhere, right? For us to still consider it an ethical and fair representation of a true event, a true tragedy actually. And I think that's the line that both Love and Death and Candy kind of stomp all over in the end. Because the act of editing things around is inherently biased. You are going to leave certain elements out. You are going to have to streamline things. And the way one goes about that will inevitably be biased towards the story they want to tell. The problem with the two shows based on the Candy Montgomery and Betty Gore case is that the story they wanted to tell seemed to lack all the subtlety and nuance that bias in editing should be presented with. Like, you can be biased, but at least don't be so obvious about it. But they are. It's funny because when I was initially doing the research for this video, I went into it completely expecting one of these two to be the one I will use as my good example, my what to do example, if you will. Imagine my surprise when doing the research, then watching the shows yielded pages upon pages of complaints from these two shows. And a surprising amount of appreciation for Monster, which is literally the complete opposite of what I was expecting. Monster was the whole reason I even wanted to do this video, thinking it probably broke every ethical guideline there is out there. And while it's certainly not perfect in any way, because we're at a point where it's just impossible for a fictionalization of true crime events to be perfect, it actually manages to handle its subject and the actual facts of the case with way more respect than Love and Death and Candy ever do. Like, out of the three of them, it does the best job, and is the only one I had things to actually praise in, which is kind of wild to me. But before I get into what I want to praise about Monster and the issues I still have with it that I think are just issues inherent with the genre itself, I want to first talk about Love and Death and Candy and the vast number of issues I have with them specifically. So basically, I'm presenting the shows like we're discussing here on my own personal scale of most ethically egregious to least ethically egregious, and we're starting with Love and Death. This is the one that I thought was going to be my what to do example out of all of them. And it turned completely into like the entire what not to do list. This one is seriously the worst on the list for me, that I'm actually kind of mad about it. Especially for a case I had no like interest in beforehand. I wasn't interested in the angle they were going to take with it or how accurate they were going to be, which can sometimes happen when you've already like studied, so to say, the case being covered. I didn't have any preformed attachment to the case besides just consuming the text that the shows seem to be based on in some way or another. And even just from reading the book, I started to feel icky. The book itself feels like it sets up the unbalanced depiction that informs the two shows that came out about the case. And while I think they both stand on some morally dubious ground, there's one main reason that I think Love and Death ends up ranking lower than Candy for me regarding its ethical standards. From the beginning, Love and Death seems to have more investment in what it presents to the viewer than in sticking close to the story. And it manifests itself in something as seemingly trivial as the physical depiction of Candy, and in some cases Betty. Both Elizabeth Olsen and Jessica Biel are gorgeous women, obviously. That's another thing that comes with adapting true crime cases for the screen. Actors have certain things about them that are the entire reason they become actors, and they carry that on their person at all times. They also, through their stardom, through their fame, have access to things that allow them to maintain a level of purely physical appeal that two middle-class suburban housewives living in Texas would not have had access to. I made that so vague. I meant like facials and stuff, and like surgery, I guess. And that's fine. We learn to accept the differences that would carry when we're watching like shows about true crime. But I feel like Love and Death almost used that in a way. So Candy's hair is pretty recognizable. It's short length and like its tight curls that shorten the hair even further, forming an instantly identifiable marker on her head. Love and Death noticeably decides to eschew that in favor. Did I say that right? Eschew. Let's hope. Google says eschew or eschew, so we're going to put both in there. It decides to eschew that in favor of a slightly longer, sleek, blonde bob, which I immediately thought was kind of an odd decision. But I feel like Love and Death makes a lot of odd decisions in the way it doesn't try really hard to physically model the actors after their real-life counterparts. Usually, that's something that a lot of media based on true stories actually relies on. It's something people even get kind of excited about seeing, the transformations. But I feel like Love and Death almost leans into the superstar glamour thing. What are you driving? But I feel like Love and Death almost leans into the superstar glamour thing, instead of trying to subvert it, deciding not to have Elizabeth Olsen sport Candy's famous hairstyle in favor of a more comely hairstyle, which is interesting because there's direct reference to her hair in the show itself.
I really do love the hair. Thank you.
When her defense lawyer, Don Crowder, tells her to lose the perm and style her hair in a way that the jury would find more appealing, more becoming of an innocent housewife that would never be intent on murder, which is something that actually happened in real life. But the point is that there is direct reference in the text to the way the perception of Candy and the way she looks informed a regular person's view of her crime, and whether someone like her could have done something that heinous had she not been cornered. And yet, they still chose to change one of Candy's most identifying physical characteristics into something that, again, in the text, is viewed as easier on the eyes, more traditional, more acceptable. Now, to me, that already seems like a pretty odd and deliberate choice to make here. But it becomes even harder to ignore when we see how much less impactful Don Crowder asking her to change her hair comes off here. Because with Candy's actual hair, with the real life change, the change was pretty noticeable. A very deliberate aesthetic choice to alter her image and paint her in a very specific light. It was his way of trying to control every factor that goes into the way the jury perceived her. But with her hair already basically being the end result Crowder wanted for the entire duration of Love and Death, the change is negligible and doesn't really signal anything regarding his prowess as a lawyer and the details that went into painting Candy in the light he wanted. And yet, they still included that, which seems kind of really stupid to me. So why?
Why?
Why make that decision despite how much it takes away from an incredible visual illustration of John Crowder's tactic that was powerful enough to allow Candy Montgomery to walk free? Why? Well, it's in the show. Why did Don Crowder do it? Why did he change her hair? To make her more appealing, easier to categorize, easier to view as a traditional housewife, could never pose any danger to anyone, and was just put in an impossible situation. The show did with Candy's physical appearance exactly what her own defense lawyer did. And I feel like that already tells us almost everything we need to know in such a seemingly small decision. Another seemingly small thing is their depiction of part of Candy's defense, the hypnosis sessions. A lot of people, including the book itself, acknowledge how this is basically junk science. In fact, it's not even allowed as expert testimony in at least 22 states. But Texas is not one of those states, although there seems to be work being done to actually change that. But it's even worse in this case because some guy hypnotized her and suddenly she recalled a memory of her mother shushing her at the hospital, and Betty Gore shushing her is basically what accounts for how utterly gruesome and how much of an overkill that murder was. Like, really? Even its mere introduction into the defense was approached apprehensively because the defense themselves knew how far-fetched and ridiculous it sounded, and they were afraid that it would make the entire rest of their case appear to be on shakier ground. But it looks like they just had to present something to account for how violent the actual murder was, because no one was buying that level of overkill for self-defense. And I think that's exactly what that expert testimony did. It was not something people believed wholeheartedly necessarily, but the case the defense presented was pretty solid. And they just needed something to stick in the back of the jury's minds, to hang the overkill aspect of the murder on. And this was right there. And this is all purely speculation on my part, but just based on how things would have appeared to me had I been in the same situation. It's basically just the need to know that there is some explanation out there for how violent she got, not necessarily the correct explanation. That's not how Love and Death portrays it at all, though. Love and Death takes you into the actual hypnosis sessions that we, once again, could have no factual proof of ever happening this exact way. Not only that, but they add in little details that I just did not come across in the book at all. And I'm kind of inclined to believe they didn't really get them anywhere else either. Details they just decided to add in there to bolster the defense, a defense that has already rested decades ago. Such as Candy being pricked by a needle, but feeling absolutely no pain because the doctor hypnotized her into not feeling pain. And like her getting goosebumps, an actual physical reaction on her body in reaction to the doctor hypnotizing her into believing it's cold. All of that just to grant validity to the hypnosis as a concept. So once it is more trustworthy as a method of treatment, then subsequently, so is the claim that she recovered during the hypnosis session. That when Betty Gore supposedly shushed her, it triggered some childhood trauma deep within her. Which, I'm sorry, I don't mean to dismiss anyone's trauma, but it is kind of ridiculous that a shush is the childhood trauma you carry deep within you, and it works like a sleeper agent trigger word, and it sets you off onto a violent rampage. Okay. And that's why Betty Gore had 41 stabs with an axe in her, some of which hit so deep that the axe had to be wiggled out of her bone and swung back into her head. That's the kind of attack we're talking about here. That's the kind of attack the show chose to stretch the facts to excuse with a bogus hypnosis session that they decided to turn into some real-life spy movie shit. And while I already had issues with all the weird changes, I think the most obviously biased decision the show makes happens in what is its most important scene and the way it frames it, the actual murder. You see, all we know of this murder is what forensics tells us, like I said, and to a much less reliable extent, what Candy Montgomery reported on the stand. The forensics tell us there was an axe. There was a struggle. The forensics do not tell us that Betty Gore charged at Candy with an axe and told her that she was going to kill her. Candy tells us that. And yet, the show doesn't choose to frame that in the unreliable light it should be. It doesn't frame it with the inherent suspicion that should be present when portraying the testimony of a murder suspect. The show frames everything Candy reports happened just like it frames every other scene, like it's fact, like it slots right into the normal narrative of the show, like it's being told to us by an omniscient narrator rather than an unreliable one. So what could they have done, you might ask? How can they tell an effective story that allows them to show us the violence we expect to see while maintaining our skepticism regarding the factual accuracy of what we are being told? Well, luckily, we have Candy to show us exactly how that aspect of the story could have been handled. Now, to start off, this is not to say that the only way to tell the story is the way Candy did. In fact, I have a lot of issues with that show too, that I will go over in a minute. But this is the one thing it did right. I'm sure there are other ways the ambiguity and the truthfulness of the narrative could have been portrayed, but Candy chose this one, and Love and Death chose just nothing. It chose to ignore said ambiguity, so this is what I have to work with to present as the good example. Candy just makes the very simple and easy decision to not initially show you the actual attack from what we perceive as an objective point of view. The initial scene is the murder itself, presented not through the frame of any specific perspective, so the show chooses to keep the camera outside, just to show you Candy going in, and then her frazzled and panicked reappearance when she comes out. Keeping the camera outside for the whole time she was actually in there, mirroring real life, where none of us were in there, none of us got taken inside. Our objective knowledge of the truth regarding what happened in that house is exactly the way the camera portrayed it. All we know objectively is that Candy went in there, something happened, then she came out, and in the process Betty Gore died, and that's quite literally all we know. And then when the show needs to present the only version of events we have, the one Candy provided, it deliberately frames it through her testimony, once again mirroring the extent of our knowledge in real life. All we know about what happened inside the house is provided from the biased perspective of Candy Montgomery's testimony, after she was accused of the murder, so as a defendant. So the show includes that framing when it depicts the scene for us, something Love and Death chose to not include. Yes, in the later scenes we get a depiction through Candy's testimony of the full confrontation itself, and it includes the same framing device, but there are a lot of details included in what appeared to us to be the initial unbiased depiction of the events that are impossible to factually confirm, that it renders the later ambiguous framing completely moot. It's a moot point.
A moo point?
Yeah, it's like a cow's opinion. It just doesn't matter. It's moo.
All the later scenes showcasing the events through her testimony tell me about Love and Death is that they know how to frame things with the appropriate apprehension regarding their truth. They just chose not to with certain details, which makes it even worse, muddying up the waters regarding what we know to be true versus what is provided only through the testimony of the defendant. Just makes things so much harder to separate and makes it harder to define the liberties with the truth the show chose to take. Okay, that was the good thing about Candy. The one thing that I think it did most correctly, besides also choosing to keep Candy's haircut. My other issues with Candy, the show, not the person, also applied to Love and Death, and I think they apply to both the shows because so much of the source material, whether the shows are explicitly based on them or not, mainly the book, Evidence of Love, seem to have also had the same issues, and they're largely concerning the way Betty Gore is painted after her death. You see, in the actual trial, the defense had very specific tactics that worked almost a bit too well. Since they opened the trial by establishing that Candy did do it, the defense team, and mainly Don Crowder, had to focus their energy on the characters of the two women involved in this fatal confrontation. They had to paint Candy as someone who would have never resorted to this kind of violence had she not been backed into a corner with her life on the line. And they had to paint Betty Gore as someone who absolutely would have done exactly that. Someone who was insecure and unhinged, that she would have been the aggressor in the situation, just to end up losing the confrontation and by extension losing her life. That's how the defense presented the case in a way that allowed Candy Montgomery to walk free, which just means that they did their job well. But the issue is that that's how the shows present the narrative too. They completely stick to this portrayal of both women, probably because it allows for good dramatic tension and allows the viewer to root for someone. But the fact is that the book on the case also largely plays into this portrayal that was established by the defense team of a woman on trial for murder.
What I want to know is why Betty Gore came at her good friend Candy Montgomery with an axe and how the heck she got chopped up instead.
History is written by the victors, and all retellings of this story in all mediums seem to skew heavily in favor of the narrative put forth by the defense in the trial itself. There tends to be a lot of emphasis on Candy being very loved and popular, and on Betty Gore being confrontational and abrasive, citing an incident she had with her new pastor as one of the main examples, despite the fact that a majority of the witnesses attributing these traits to her were witnesses for the defense, intentionally put there to paint this very specific image of her. And again, when this is done in a trial, it's the defense doing their job. But when it's done in every subsequent work covering the case, it just starts to feel like outright character assassination. The character assassination of someone who's already dead and can't defend herself. And I think about how every single person I know has people out there who, if they were victims in this situation, would absolutely have people that could serve as witnesses for the defense against them, who I'm sure have less than positive memories of them. We literally all have our moments. We all have instances where we leave a very negative impression on someone, and the defense had to focus on those for a reason. But it's astounding that that's the only image we get of Betty Gore now. One of the most notable differences is that in Candy, Betty seems, well, awful. The real Betty Gore was more nuanced than her on-screen counterpart. In her hometown of Norwich, Kansas, her family member told me Betty is still thought highly of by people who knew her. She was a popular student involved in a ton of activities and had a lot of friends, the family member said. After marrying Alan and moving to Texas, though, Betty struggled. Betty had difficulty adapting to her teaching career, had bouts of depression, and was afraid of being alone. And the thing is, I am not a big proponent of the idea that just because someone died, we can't bring up their flaws or criticize their character or anything like that. Most people don't die angels. It's just so uncomfortable in this case because the balance is so tipped. Not only is Betty just not here to defend herself, so much of the image given to her is just incredibly exaggerated and one-sided, just by virtue of where it originated from. And then the shows take it even a step further by fabricating events that we have no factual proof of ever occurring, to hammer the point home even further. I said further twice. To illustrate to us just how awful Betty truly was, and always contrasting them with how loved and popular and helpful Candy was. Linsky's Betty, though, has no positive attributes. She is mopey and vengeful and never displays any warmth towards anyone, quietly simmering with an all-consuming rage. Linsky scours her way through scene after scene, shooting daggers at her husband. Even the adultery perpetrated by Candy and Alan is blamed on Betty and her behavior. In the Texas Monthly retelling, Betty's unhappiness, as well as their lackluster sex life, is what drove Alan to eventually have an affair with the outgoing, popular Candy after she propositioned him in 1978, when Betty was pregnant with her second child. When Alan finally gives in to Candy's advances, you're almost rooting for him, if only so he can escape Betty for a few hours. Like, is this not completely and utterly fucked? Not only is this woman dead, not only was she brutally murdered, but now every bad day she's had, every imperfect action she's taken, her own mental health and its decline, at a time when a lot of women's mental health tends to take a nosedive, even her own sex life, everything is picked apart, scrutinized, and then used to justify what happened to her. It's barbaric. Like, that's the only way I can describe it. And the worst part about all this is that her family and loved ones just have to sit through it. Cases like this are basically public domain. The creators, the people profiting off of them, are under absolutely no legal obligation to reach out to the family or to compensate them for their depiction of their loved ones in any way. In fact, they very much did not do any of that in this case. A family member who asked to remain anonymous to protect their privacy told me that they personally were not contacted before either series was made, nor were they informed that the projects were in the works. So Betty Gore's family, her two children, one of whom is the child Candy Montgomery left in that house all alone for 13 hours, knowing her mother was lying dead in the other room. Those two kids who grew up and became adults, and all the people who have ever loved her and cared for her, have to scroll through streaming services and see Candy's name and face just plastered right there, knowing if they watch the shows, it will just be a depiction of how maybe their mother kinda deserved it, actually. And that is the biggest issue I have with this. There are major ethical transgressions, obviously. But had this been a victimless thing, had the person being torn apart not been someone who has already gone through enough literal violence, had she not been someone with loved ones left in the world, people who are affected by Hollywood suddenly trudging up their trauma and using it to bank on the true crime craze and vapidly entertain a few viewers, I would not have had nearly as much of an issue with any of it. But I can't look at either of these shows and not see the family that had to and still has to suffer, and the person who continues to have no say in the story of her own murder, and the world that continues to perpetuate the image the person that took her life and her defense team painted of her, forgetting the multi-layered complex person that existed underneath, because it's easier for us, the audience, to process the murder and the subsequent not guilty verdict when we can stop thinking of her as a person we can see our loved ones and maybe even ourselves in, and can instead just cast her in a one-dimensional, unlikable light, like her on-screen counterpart, silently glowering at Candy through the trial, never saying anything, because she can't, because she never got the chance, and she never will. And in what is the most surprising turn of events for me, I now want to talk about the show on this list that I found the least ethically problematic. Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. Again, that is not to say there are no issues with it, there absolutely are. But I feel like the issues with Monster are, again, the ones just intrinsically present in almost any work of true crime fiction that will be made. Not ones very specific to the show, which I think was the most surprising element of all this for me. And here, I'm mostly referring to all the elements that were within the narrative's control. The ones where the storyline could have easily veered into aggressively exploitative territory, and they just didn't. And while this kind of feels like celebrating the absolute bare minimum, the fact is that, like the past two examples show, true crime media hardly strives for even the bare minimum at this point. And so many more of them are more concerned with the retention of viewers and how to tell the story in a way that will bring people back to the streaming service every week or for every episode, rather than they are with how sensitively they approach the lives affected by the tragedies portrayed within them. And I hate to say it, because Ryan Murphy is just pissing me off lately, but I do think the show itself handled a lot of things that could have been completely fumbled very well. I will of course also address the things it did not handle well, but I do want to be fair because of all the shows on this list, it got the loudest and most aggressive backlash, to the point that even I avoided it up until like 2 months ago. And while the people who were unhappy with it had every right to be unhappy and they deserved so much better, which again we will address further a bit later, I think so much other true crime media deserves just as much backlash, if not more. All that being said, I want to open with the things I think the show handled really well, and it starts with the first episode, the opening scene actually. The show makes the choice to have our introduction to Dahmer be through the blood on his knife, not through him as a person, which I think is such a brilliant but also effective choice for such a crucial moment in any narrative. But in Dahmer, we see the blood he shed before we ever see him. We see the knife with the blood on it. We see the effect of his crime before we ever see his face. It delays humanizing him till you have an idea of who you're about to meet. It's so easy to do it the other way around. Humanize the killer first, familiarize you with him as a person first, before you get exposed to seeing the things he does, which is exactly what the two previously mentioned shows did. Sometimes the thought process behind it may be that it's to build character and add layers, but I think that's kind of bullshit, because it's a lot easier for our brains to humanize murderers like that. Our idea of murderers is monstrous and inhuman, very set in stone, that any shred of anything to the contrary, any brief instance of humanity, serves to contradict that image in our heads, and in turn humanize them to a more dramatic degree had they been anyone else. I think it's very impressive that this show manages to subvert that, from its very beginning opening shots. He's introduced through the aftermath of his crime, a reminder that seeing his face should not make you forget who is behind that mask. And obviously it's not the same because Candy's not a serial killer who ate her victims, she's not an evil person, but like, the crime Candy did commit was kind of brutal. And it's just like, I'm not comparing them as human beings because that's really unfair and like absolute. I like I said earlier, I don't have issues with Candy Montgomery as a person, and I think even the defense painting Betty in a bad light was just them trying to get her off, which I think anyone would have done. So I'm not, like, I want to reiterate, I'm very much not comparing them, but separately, the crime Candy committed was kind of brutal, and it's just the fact that the show spent a majority of their runtime humanizing her in every way within their power, while utterly dehumanizing the actual victim. It kind of starts to feel ghoulish, and that's the only thing I'm contrasting here, not the people themselves, because they are so on like completely different sides of existence. Anyway, back to the show. There's all actually, never mind, not back to the show. My god. There's also the choice of the non-linear narrative and where they chose to start the story. Monster starts with Dahmer's arrest. That's where the first episode is. It starts with him attempting to murder Tracy Edwards, then Edwards cleverly escaping and subsequently getting Dahmer arrested and put away for his crimes. And while this on the surface sounds like a small choice for the narrative, I think it sets a tone for the entire show and shapes our perception of Dahmer in a very specific way, taking him off the pedestal that watching him get away with committing murders for like 8 or 9 episodes straight could have put him on. No, we meet him at his defeat. Our image of him is set as he is defeated. We are under no illusions of his incredible prowess as a murderer. We are under no illusions of how intelligent or elusive he is. None of that. He gets caught, we meet him as he's getting caught, and it's great. It's a moment of triumph to alleviate the suffering we are about to witness for hours upon hours. And it almost immediately establishes him as like, honestly, a loser. It can be so easy to overinflate these men's exploits with serial killers. It can be so easy to pretend that it must have taken some superhuman observational skills and trickery to get to the body counts they did. And what the show does here is show you how much that is not true. It also establishes the recurring theme of the utter incompetence of the law enforcement here, especially against the minority groups Dahmer consistently targeted, setting up exactly the reason for Dahmer getting away with it for so long, showing us that it's a systemic issue on a macro scale, rather than attributing it to Dahmer's meticulous planning or anything positive on his part. In fact, in those opening scenes, Dahmer's honestly kind of a dumbass. He just sits there waiting after Edwards escapes, almost assured in his survival, almost like he just assumes no one will ever come after him. And it's borderline justified, I guess, because every time he almost got caught before, and even the one time where he did get fully caught, he just got away with it through sheer dumb luck and the aforementioned police incompetence. That doesn't make him come off any less stupid though, as we watch him sit there not even attempting to clean up or cover anything, knowing he just told a man that he was going to eat his heart, and that man just escaped. Like, he was just not going to bring anyone back over to arrest him. And again, that's what I think the show's opening episode does really well. It provides us with a victory and something to get us through all the horrors we're about to witness. It establishes the incompetence that is responsible for Dahmer's criminal run, and it knocks him off a pedestal before there is even a chance for anyone to establish one for him. It also immediately gives you someone to root for. We immediately have Tracy Edwards to side with, to root for, to cheer on, and we get to see him win. That's something that, again, the other two shows fumble completely, despite having the time to allow you to get to know the victim thoroughly, because there's only one victim in those. They do not bother to get you to root for her. They are not trying. In fact, if there's anyone they're putting an active effort to get you to root for, it's Candy. I think Monster's opening episode is just really solid. There are a lot of very deliberate choices made, and I think they were made ethically, with effort to not glorify any part of Jeffrey Dahmer, with effort to establish how there's absolutely nothing to glorify about him. They don't even allow room for begrudging respect, like the kind some people might reserve for people who are like weirdly good at what they do, even if you don't approve of what they do. There's absolutely no hint of that either. And that's another aspect of what makes Dahmer the most solid show in terms of ethics on this list. It's the fact that none of the leniencies it takes with the truth are meant to portray Dahmer in a better, more sympathetic light. In fact, it actually seems to rely on them to be able to humanize the victims as much as possible in the short time span they're given. Since we follow Dahmer around for all 10 episodes, but we tend to be with the victims for a portion of an episode. One episode at the most. They use some shortcuts, some cutting dramatic moments to humanize them and their families. Now again, the fact that we spend so much time with the murderer and so little time with his victims, since he has so many, is a built-in flaw when retelling the stories of serial killers. Especially one with this many victims. But I do think the show handled it the best it can, which is kind of the running theme here. Which brings me to something else that goes under this big bullet point, but I think definitely deserves its own section of praise. Episode 6, Silenced. Episode 6 follows Tony Hughes, an aspiring model, a gay deaf black man, and eventually one of Dahmer's victims. It is probably the most praised episode of the show, and besides being generally very well executed, I think it deserves all the praise it gets largely because of what it does to the true crime narrative. This episode is the deliberate reversal of everything I mentioned was wrong with true crime storytelling. Especially the sense of how unbalanced the narrative inherently has to be, because only one side lives to tell their version of the story, and only one side gets the narrative focus and build-up it takes to make them into the real, fully fleshed representation of the human being they were. Episode 6 of Monster clearly addresses all that head-on. Yes, it is only one episode of a 10-episode show, but like I was saying earlier, the inability to focus on victims and tell their life stories and build them up when telling the story of a serial killer, just by virtue of how many victims need to be covered, that's completely gone here. Not only do we get a pretty fleshed out backstory of one of his victims, so thoroughly in fact that I hate continuing to call him a victim, because the show turns him into a fully realized person, but I'm only using the word here to illustrate like the subversion of the true crime narrative as a whole, so I have to use the roles within it. But the show also deliberately immerses you in his point of view, in his experience, by manipulating the sound, having it cut in and out when it wants to place you fully in his shoes. Front door. When it wants you to perceive the world around the way he perceived it. Something that these true crime narratives are often unable to fully accomplish, especially if they give us enough backstory on the killers, as they usually do, is painting them as the villains they were to the people whose lives they took. We can scoff at the title of villain all we want, especially when dealing with like a human's multi-layered nature and the complexity of actual human beings that are not a figment of one's imagination. But at the end of the day, for the people they killed and their loved ones, that's exactly what they were. They are every nightmare and every fear realized. They are what your parents warned you about growing up. And in episode 6, I appreciated the fact that Dahmer showing up truly delivered on the magnitude of the evil we were dealing with. Because we knew it before, obviously, it was fully established throughout the show that this man is pure evil. But still, coming after spending close to 20 minutes with someone else, someone innocent, and having to see Dahmer standing right there, actually was sitting, knowing where this is going, knowing how things are going to end up for Tony just because of Dahmer's presence, the hatred you feel for him as a character in a TV show, but also as a person who existed as a real-life monster, knowing what he's about to do, and knowing a bit more about who he's about to do all that to. It truly delivers on highlighting his monstrosity. After consuming the show for episode upon episode for hours straight, you can get kind of desensitized to the horrendous acts of violence and inhumanity being portrayed. They kind of start to shock you less and less the more you see them. Which is horrible to say, but that's kind of how the human psyche works. To protect you against the ugliness of the world, the more you see something, the more it becomes normalized to you. And often true crime content, and general thriller crime content, is not super cognizant of that. But here, the banality of evil is subverted because episode 6 kind of resets your brain in a way. Despite the mounting sense of dread and impending doom going through me for the entire episode, I felt an actual chill run down my spine the minute the camera cut and Dahmer was sitting right there. Being invested in Tony's life, you start to hope, the way you would for a protagonist in a movie whom you're endeared to, the way you would in something less dark and bleak. You hope, against all logic, that this will just turn into a different show, a different genre, that he will make it, that he will not have to come face to face with a monster. And then all your hope is shattered with Dahmer sitting right there. And it's just really well done. Again, I didn't want to go out of my way to praise this, but I can't even lie, it's just really well done. Another thing that Dahmer does exceptionally well, that a lot of true crime can tend to not do such a good job portraying, is that, like I said before, it truly does not glorify Dahmer or his criminal prowess. He's not the brightest Crayola in the pack or anything. It's not his exceptional Sherlock Holmes level brain that allows him to get away with things. It is shown clearly and further highlighted time and time again that the only way Dahmer continues to get away with things for as long as he does is simply the fact that he manages to exploit the gaping holes present in an already broken system. And nowhere is that more demonstrated than in the cases, of the Synthesymphone family. In 1988, Dahmer actually got caught, like I said, for something pretty horrendous too. Not like a small citation like his public indecency one, he got caught for fondling a young underage boy. Samsak Synthesymphone. And like I said, he barely gets a slap on the wrist. And again, it's hard not to imagine what would have happened had the judge dealt him the appropriate punishment right then and there. How many lives could have been saved? But in an unbelievably cruel twist of fate, one of those lives that could have been saved, one of Dahmer's victims, 3 years later, was Samsak Synthesymfone's brother, Konorak Synthesymphone. Konorak was 14 when Dahmer drilled a hole into his skull and injected hydrochloric acid into his frontal lobe in an attempt to create what he described as human zombies. In the end, Konorak died, but not before he mustered all his strength and attempted a daring escape, coming so close to succeeding and surviving the night. It's genuinely horrifying to think about it, to have to come to grips with the fact that he actually doesn't. This was the only incident concerning Dahmer that I knew any details of before the show aired, and I think it's actually the reason I never delved into the Dahmer case too much, because one cursory glance at the Wikipedia page and getting exposed to this specific part of the case was all I needed to know. It taught me that there were still horrors in the world that I could not handle even briefly reading about, without having it genuinely alter my perception of humanity. Because the thing is that Konorak's death could have been prevented, should have been prevented. There were multiple opportunities and he was failed on every possible level by everyone in power. After Konorak escaped, naked, bruised, and bleeding, 3 young women found him, Chandra Smith, Tina Spivey, and Nicole Childress. And they truly did everything within their power to help him. But before they could get him out of harm's way, get him to safety, Dahmer shows up and explains to the cops that Konorak is his 19-year-old boyfriend. The cops choose to believe Dahmer despite how much the boy's appearance does not fit his description, and they aggressively silence the women's protests when they try to explain how he does not look 19, how he's bleeding, how nothing about this feels right. Felt right for the cops though, and Konorak was returned to Dahmer, his eventual killer, after a cursory glance at some Polaroids Dahmer took the night before, that he used to prove that they were dating. It's like they wanted to get this off their hands as fast as possible, like they're gonna get cooties or something, and that's not even a stretch because following the incident, the cops are heard laughing it off, making derogatory gay jokes about Konorak and Dahmer. And had the cops not been so hasty to get this off their hands, had they bothered to view Conrad as a human being and given him the fraction of the time it would have taken to look at him and his state thoroughly, to even run Dahmer's info through the system to find out he was a registered offender, was convicted of assaulting a young boy before, one who seemed suspiciously similar to Conrad. You know what, not even any of that, to even just escort him away from Dahmer instead of right into his hands. The life of an innocent 14-year-old boy with his whole future ahead of him could have been spared that night, had they set their prejudice aside and done their job with even a fraction of integrity. They could have saved a life, maybe even several. They could have cut Dahmer off right there and stopped him from accruing any more victims. But obviously they chose not to. Hell, had Dahmer been sufficiently punished for the first offense, instead of being seen as a bright young man, instead of the people in charge automatically seeing potential in him that he never earned, that he never possessed, that he never had to prove, had Conrad's own brother been given the respect he deserved, none of this would have happened. I realize I'm not talking about the show at all here, but this part of the case truly always gets to me because the smallest bit of humanity could have saved that boy's life, and that always breaks my heart to think about. Anyway, the show does a good job portraying this part with the horror it deserves. I honestly don't know how to talk about this further right now. But it is given the time. The Synthesis Phone family are given the presence on screen that you need to truly feel the magnitude of the loss, of the horrific trauma Dahmer put these people through. And it is used to demonstrate the multiple levels of the broken system that Dahmer exploited, that allowed him to get away with this for as long as he did, that allowed him to take this many lives. And the show continues to highlight this aspect of the tragedy wherever it can. Law enforcement and the legal system are not painted as the superheroes they often are portrayed as in solved true crime cases. And maybe that's just because they blatantly were not that here. They were very much part of the problem, a major part of the problem, I'd say. But the show does a really good job showcasing that and using its time and the things it focused on wisely to give us the relevant facts and portray Dahmer's background and escalations while simultaneously not taking it too far or attempting to justify his actions in any way. And that's what it came down to for me. At no point did I feel sympathy for Jeffrey Dahmer during Monster. At no point did they invent events or make up scenes to get you to feel anything of any type for him. The facts are only edited as far as it pertains to storytelling, as in the facts are not altered, but they are just adjusted to tell the most cohesive story possible, where multiple individuals can be combined into one to avoid confusion, or things that took longer are cut down and portrayed visually for dramatic effect. Stuff like that. But we don't, for example, fake an entire hypnosis session where the power of hypnotism gives Jeffrey goosebumps and sheds the light on some minor childhood trauma that triggered him into completely losing control and killing people. You see how ridiculous that sounds when you put it into any other context? Again, not comparing the size of the transgressions anyone else committed to Jeffrey Dahmer's, but it is murder at the end of the day. And going out of your way to fictionalize excuses for it and turning drunk science into some borderline supernatural shit is just, it's not right. But again, that is still not to say that Monster was flawless in any way. Far from it. Just because it's by far the least offensive on the list does not mean it does not have its major issues. So let's get into those for a bit. After Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story came out, multiple family members of Dahmer's victims came forward to discuss how traumatizing having what was probably the most harrowing experience of their lives be turned into entertainment for the masses is. Rita Isbell also spoke with Insider.com regarding that, and how watching her pointedly emotional statement in court where she intentionally let her feelings show as a way to show Jeffrey what lack of control actually looks like, which is what he claimed he was going through, that's what led to the murders, while maintaining his calm and unaffected demeanor through it all, negating the validity of his own statement. Isbell then discusses seeing someone playing her and seeing everything she said verbatim on screen, but shares that she was not even contacted prior to that. I think the whole conversation with her is really important, as it is really important to give the people actually directly affected by Jeffrey's actions the chance to speak, to give them a voice. So I will link the whole thing down below. I will also put quotes and screenshots up on screen because I need to summarize what she said, but I don't want anything to be taken out of context or glossed over, so please take a second to read it if you're able to. But that's the thing with true crime. True crime has obvious victims, the ones who die or get hurt, but it also creates victims and the ones who are left behind, who have to witness their pain be turned into entertainment fodder, who have to watch TV executives use the words they said at the height of their pain to put together an entertaining work that no one makes money off of but them. By them I mean the execs. Isbell said that this was not about the money for her. She does not want the money for herself, but she could understand had they given the money to the victims' children. But none of that happens in these cases. The money goes to the people who make the shows. The families have to watch their pain, their suffering, their trauma get repurposed, while there is nothing they can really do. Once again, these cases are mostly public domain, the facts of them are public domain, since facts cannot be copyrighted and they're just so commonly circulated. They are out there for people to do whatever they want with them without having to reach out to the victims' families or to compensate them in any way. And again, that just feels wrong. Like, there's no way around it. It is genuinely just wrong. The way it works is wrong. That these people have to be bombarded and often have to relive such trauma without even being contacted, being informed, or even being compensated is wrong. I know Isabel said it's not about the money, but there is nothing wrong with it being about the money, because the people who make these shows don't make them for free. It's about the money for them too. It just feels like something is fundamentally unbalanced in the way this whole system is currently structured. That your suffering doesn't end with the loss of your loved one, or with the trial, or the headlines. No, you have to sit there and watch your story get edited, adjusted, and retold. Your pain dramatized and repurposed over and over and over again. And in some cases, you get a show like Monster that kind of seems like it had no malicious intent and tried to do its best by its victims' stories, and that's the best case scenario. Like, really, that they do the best by the victims and their stories, but they do not do their best by the families. So even in the best case scenario, we have victims left behind. And then you have something like Love and Death, which truly seemed like it wasn't trying to do its best by anyone. They just did whatever they wanted, and it doesn't seem like surviving children or of the deceased or anything of the sort was even remotely on their mind. And if you lose a loved one to something that can be repurposed into true crime, it kind of feels like it's just luck of the draw, which end of the spectrum you will be forced to fall on, and you have absolutely no say in any of that at all. And is that not just terrifying? Once again, I am absolutely not advocating for the eradication of true crime. Years of my life would have been empty had I not been obsessed with true crime videos and podcasts. I also think they did help me prepare for like a lot of sketchy situations I would get myself into. So I completely understand where our interest and fascination comes from. I mean, I still have my interest and fascination with it. I just now try to do my own research instead of having information fed to me by like one singular source, because I think that's a big issue. But it does not matter, because either way, it's consumption of true crime and it plays into the big picture, and I still consume true crime. So the big picture here is just that maybe there's another way. Maybe the people who make these can put more care, or even just like an ounce of empathy would be more than some of them give, toward the people who don't even get to make it to tell their side of the story, towards the people who are more than just a statistic or a stand-in to sympathize with. There's nothing that this video that I made in my room at 2 a.m., it's actually 7 a.m. right now, can really do. It's just been on my mind for a bit. I've been feeling a bit complicit towards other people's suffering, so I started researching this topic, and then I watched Love and Death, and this video ended up being far from what I thought it was going to be initially. I have no real conclusion here. There's absolutely nothing I can do besides choose not to give things that feel super exploitative of my time, and maybe listen when the families and the people affected speak up, which is why not gonna lie, I did not watch Dahmer on Netflix. But that's about all we can do. Anyway, that's it. Of this video and me rambling wasn't too boring. And if you guys want to see the new videos, you can subscribe if you want to. I know how to end this. Okay, I'm done. Bye!